So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about the role of the advisor and the link to strategy. And I'll also talk about some of the core skills to being a successful advisor. But let's start off with the role of the advisor. What is the role of an advisor, of an internal consultant, indeed of an external consultant? Basically, there are two fundamental aspects of what you're trying to do. The first is solve the problem, and then having identified what the solutions are to that particular problem is then to be able to communicate the answer. So we talk about solving the problem, it's about gathering the data. And we'll talk a lot more later on in these units about the best way to gather data. It's then about analyzing that data, synthesizing the findings, and coming up with the conclusions, the recommendations, the solutions, whatever that might happen to be. But then having come up with those recommendations, it's about communicating the answer. And you communicate the answer in a very different way and process than the way in which you've solved it. So quite often you would communicate the answer by giving the recommendations first, backing it up by the analysis, backing it up by the data. So the important thing here to recognize is that it's not just about how you do the analysis, but it's also about how you provide a compelling way in which you can communicate what that solution might be to your particular client. The next thing I want to talk to you about is the link to strategy. It's really important when you're thinking through your consulting project that it is linked through to the strategy of the organization. Why is this particular project going to make a difference to the strategy of my organization, to the results of my organization? So let's talk a little bit about strategy. And I'm not going to go into much detail around this because you've had plenty of opportunity in previous courses to understand the role of strategy and what strategy is. I actually think of strategy as being something relatively simple. At the end of the day, it's understanding where are we now, where do we want to get to, and how do we get from where we are now to where we want to get to. That's the simplest way of describing what a strategy is. On this slide here, I've given you a few more elements of what you might want to include in a strategy. So talking again about what we said earlier on, the present, where are we now? Very important to understand that. And you use things like the Porter's 5 forces, maybe you use a SWOT analysis, something like that that can help you to understand where are we now. The second aspect of the strategy and strategic thinking is the futures. What might happen in the futures? And this is where things like scenario envisioning come in. Very, very powerful tool to help you think through what are the different things that might happen that might actually flex how our strategy might have to change depending on different circumstances. And then we can talk about the vision. Where do we want to be? Okay? Let's try and articulate that in some way that makes sense to us and indeed to anybody that we want to be presenting this to. And then the options. How do we get from where we are now to where we want to be, understanding what those futures might be looking like. And then finally making some decisions about what we want to do next. Okay, we've got all these different options. Let's make some choices. What is it that we want to do next? Executing that and then learning from that particular process. Strategy, and I'm sure you've been told this before in previous courses, is very much a living process. It's not something that you just do once. But it's really important as an advisor, as a consultant, that you understand the strategy of the organization because you want to make sure that what you do is the problem that you're trying to solve is that strategic problem that can make a difference to the organization. So the next thing I want to talk to you about then is different styles of consulting. So there are 3 basic styles or roles that you play as an advisor or a consultant within an organization or to an organization. The first is that expert role. You are the expert in a particular subject, and that's why the organization is asking you to help or is asking you to provide them with some advice. You know something, you know more than they do about a particular topic. The second is that pair of hands. Okay, we just don't have enough people to do this. Come and give us a hand. And certainly in big projects, that's quite often the role of a consultant, is to just be that pair of hands, helping them out as they go through a particular project or process where they just don't have the capability to do it themselves. But the more usual one that you'll tend to find is this collaborative role, where you are working together with your client on solving a particular problem. And this is where it does actually work best, because you are working together, you're working collaboratively. You are tapping into the client's knowledge of the organization and you're bringing your own knowledge of what you've perhaps done previously so that comes together to provide some really good solutions for the client. So that collaborative way is the ideal way in which you want to be working as you're putting together some advice or consulting to a client. Let's talk a little bit then about the traits of a business advisor. And I've got a fairly busy slide here, but it's important to understand all of these different traits that might exist. So be prepared to ask those provoking questions. Important that you do provoke the client a little bit, that you are trying to dig in, ask the 5 whys, okay? Keep asking why. You sometimes do have to be a bit directive in what you're trying to do. Tell the client what you think is the best way forward. The whole analytical thinking, critical skill to have as a business advisor as well. You are there to synthesize facts and data, come up with answers. And you want to produce results that are specific to the organization, very much aligned to their long-term goals. Conversations are always 2 ways. I always think that conversations are one of the most important aspects of being a consultant. It's how you get the best information out of a particular client. And by interviewing people who work within that client, you'll quite often find the best ideas coming out of it. You want to be big picture focused too. You want to be able to look at that big picture and understand exactly what that might mean from a client's point of view. Thinking outside the box is a classic sort of term that people use here. And that's what you do bring as a consultant or an advisor, is that broader knowledge of what might have happened, and maybe experience that you had in other industries that you can be bringing into this particular industry as well. And obviously what you're trying to do is make sure that the whole thing is better for the organization. As I say, focus on those corporate results, very important indeed. The other thing too about being an advisor is it's a long-term relationship. I've certainly found in my consulting experience that the best organizations, the best clients that I've worked with, I've always had that long-term relationship, sometimes 10, 20 years of a relationship within that organization. And interestingly enough, quite often in those organizations too, CEOs have come and gone, but I have remained in there as an advisor to that particular organization at a very senior level. But be prepared to say no too. There are times as a consultant when you've got to turn around to the clients and say, no, I do not agree with you. I do not think this is the right thing to do. And believe you me, as a consultant in my history, I have been thrown out of clients because I have told the client, I do not think you are doing the right thing. I will leave it up to you to work out when the best time to actually be able to do that is going to be. It's not easy. So that's enough on some consulting and advising skills. I hope that gives you some indication of some of the skills that you're going to need as an advisor to an organization or within an organization.